Hey everybody, this is Miss Miller, your Photo 1 teacher. I wanted to create a video to help you guys learn and go through the work process of creating your first project portfolio. And we've been learning a little bit about Adobe Camera Raw, and today I went over how to process your images. So we went over a little bit about how to edit your images and process them into JPEGs. And I wanted to create a video to help you do that better. So I'm just going to kind of go over what I've done before. So what you want to do is go to your project folder. So remember, we are saving your project folder in this PC app in the C drive. So navigate to that, go to your C drive, and then go to your Photo 1 folder. So you should be dividing your images or saving them in subfolders like composition. This was our very first project, the scavenger hunt. And I was going to tell you guys, if you have any good images that you think you could use from your scavenger hunt that are also good rules, or maybe there are a few that represent the rules of composition well, you can do that or use some of these pictures. Again, sometimes the default will show your pictures in something called a list format. You can't see them or the thumbnails, but to actually see the little miniatures, if you go to the bottom right, you can click on this little camera icon and you should be able to see them in thumbnail format. Okay? So we are going to open one of your images in Adobe Camera Raw. Okay? So to do that, what you want to do is right-click, open with, and select Adobe Photoshop. So what this is supposed to do, it's supposed to open your image in Photoshop, which you can see behind, and then Adobe Raw. So the two programs are linked. You can edit your image and make enhancements, and they sort of work together. It's best to use Adobe Camera Raw first because it's non-destructive. So it allows us to change the image, edit the image, but it's not actually changing the pixels. It's actually assigning like a set of instructions telling the picture how to act. Once you edit it, then we can save it as a different file format. We can save it as a JPEG, we can save it as a TIFF, and those types of files are good for other purposes. Like the JPEG is going to be great for posting online and submitting a small digital portfolio, but you'll always have the raw file to edit. So that's why we're using Adobe Camera Raw and shooting in RAW. When you're using Adobe Camera Raw, it's best to toggle to full screen. So to do that, you just click this full screen mode right here. And with any program in Adobe, whether it's Raw, Adobe Camera Raw, or Photoshop, you should be able to hover your mouse and it should tell you what things do. So if you're trying to figure out how something works, you can do it and learn that way. And the workspace is set up like this. You have your image, you have a toolbar up here. Again, if you hover your mouse, it tells you what these do. We also have a toolbar in Photoshop. To the right, you have a workspace that has a histogram. This is a chart of your tonality. It's basically a chart of your highlights, midtones, and really dark shadow areas. It also records your colors as well, or the color temperature, so the tonality of your color. If you move down, you'll see this little set of workspaces that you can switch to. So right now we're on something called a basic palette, and this is fine for our purposes. We don't really need to go in to these just yet. But these other ones allow you to really focus in on a certain element of your photography or image. Like if you really want to play around with the tonality of the picture, we might switch to this workspace. Now you see a really big histogram, and this is just basically a way to play around with contrast. So for our purposes, just keep it on the basic tab. So there are lots of ways you can play around with this image. You can change it to black and white if you want. With black and white, you can scroll down and there's a whole slew of sliders that control how the image will look. Exposure is related to how light or dark an image is. So sometimes this is nice if an image is overexposed, you can darken it, or vice versa. If it's underexposed, you can lighten it. So that's something you can play around with. The contrast is basically sort of a nice contrast between your whites and your blacks. So it makes the whites whiter and the blacks blacker so that there's more of this contrast and pop in your image. Then you can control these individually. There's a slider just for the highlights, one for your shadows, and then one for whites and blacks. If you scroll down, you can also play around with the clarity of your image. This will help sharpen the image a little bit, and dehaze also does that as well. Just be careful, you don't want to exaggerate them too much. Again, we want the photo to look realistic, the way it looked when we were taking the picture. We don't really want to make it, you know, crazy and surreal looking. We'll do that later on in the year. You can always go back too and change things, so it's not permanent. Like I could go back and change it back to color. You can toggle too and see your before and after. So if you go down to here, you'll see a little, it looks like a Y. If you toggle, it'll show you the before and after in various formats, which is nice to kind of see how your work is, you know, how it looks. All right. So, one thing I did want to show you is the crop tool, and I'm showing it to you because I want you to be careful. Often students will do this thing that I hate, where they like part of an image and then they crop too much. You really want to try to do most of your cropping in the camera as you're taking the picture and looking through the viewfinder. When you start cropping parts of an image, the image can, one, become too pixelated, and two, sometimes you crop it in such an odd way, it just doesn't look right. So be very careful, and if you need to crop or want to crop, please ask me first so I can make sure you're not cropping too much. So this is the crop tool, and it's pretty easy to use. You just click on it and then you draw a square. This is freehand, so you just kind of draw a square. I do it around the whole image. And then you can move these little sliders to crop the image. So to make this maybe more interesting and asymmetrical, like asymmetrically balanced, I might do it like this. Okay, so that's okay cropping. To confirm the change, you just hit enter and it crops the image. Now it's not permanent. If I go back and hit the crop tool, there's my original still intact. So it just kind of shows you what it's going to look like. Some students I find will do something like this. They're like, oh, I really like this, just this part of the picture. And I'd rather you have cropped it that way in the camera as opposed to doing it now, because it's just gonna be hard to edit your picture. So stay away from those kind of cropping situations. Okay. All right. So when you're done editing a picture, you want to hit done. And this will save your edits. It's not changing your picture, I want to remind you, it's just saving your edits, okay? You can always go back to your project folder, and then you should see that picture that you just edited. Again, you would right click, open with, and select Photoshop. And it's opening Photoshop and Adobe RAW. So if I toggle, you can see it still has my before and after. And if I go to my cropping tool, I still have my original image intact. So it's not until you save it and process it in Photoshop that these changes become permanent. And even then, you're just changing it to a different file. You will always have this file intact to go back to. So now we're going to open our image in Photoshop. To do that, you go down here to open image. And now it's in Photoshop. So they look very similar. We have a histogram, and then there's a bunch of little palettes and ways to adjust your image over here that you can open up. There's a toolbar, and then a tool option bar over here that lets you choose a tool, and then you can dictate how it acts. And this is a very complex program and can be quite intimidating. So we'll take our time learning it. What I want you to do first, if you haven't already, is change your workspace. So to do that, you can go up here to Window and Workspace, and yours is probably set to Essentials. I want you to set it for photography. What's nice is that you can customize Photoshop. You can have different workspaces depending on what project you're working on. So this is a really good setup for photographers. So go ahead and click on that. And then this is your picture. It has the edits that you did in Adobe Raw. Now, you can edit further in this program. We probably won't really need to, but if for some reason you look at it and you're like, oh, I still think I need to adjust the contrast a little bit or make it a little bit lighter or darker, what you want to do, and this is what you always want to do when you open an image in Photoshop. Over here is something called the layer palette, and this is one of the key elements of Photoshop that makes it really flexible and easy to work with. Instead of editing the picture, you can create layers that affect just parts of the picture, and then you can move these layers around and delete them if necessary. So we'll get more into layers as we progress. So always, 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 no matter what, just go to Layer and then Duplicate Layer. You're going to make a background copy, and if you look over here, there's your background copy. So just make sure that's highlighted. So anything we do to this layer, it's not going to mess up your original background layer. So if something horribly goes wrong as we're editing this, we can always delete this layer and start again with the background. So in Photoshop, we are actually changing the pixels, okay? So that's why this layering program is nice. So I've decided I'm going to adjust my image just a little bit more. So if you go to Image, Adjustments, there are some ways to edit your picture. One thing that might be useful for you guys is the brightness and contrast. And again, I might brighten it a little bit. You can hit OK. If you decide you don't like it, one way to go back is to go to Edit, Step Backwards. And there, that's how it looked originally. To go forwards, just go to Image, Edit, Step Forwards. Okay. And as the year progresses, we'll learn more about these other tools. Okay, so what I'm going to do is there is going to be a part 2. So this is the transition from Adobe Camera Raw to Photoshop. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to process your image into a JPEG. So stay tuned.